Hello again, everyone, from the Fossil Hominid Vault at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm Lee Berger, a professor of paleoanthropology here at the university and an explorer at large for National Geographic. As we've been putting out the videos, lectures, and fossil demonstrations over the past week or so, I've been getting a lot of questions on social media and a lot of suggestions for what we can do in the future. And I quickly wanted to take the opportunity to address one that's coming up very frequently on my social media streams. And that is, what the heck is going on in the late Middle Pleistocene of Africa? For those of you who don't follow that question very deeply, very recently there have been a whole series of new discoveries as well as redating of fossil sites that have led us to a lot of questions about how much variation exists within the late Middle Pleistocene of Africa. How can we have so very many different species that look so very, very different from each other? So just to start the terms, I'm going to talk about the late Middle Pleistocene from around 400,000 years ago or so up until, say, 150,000 years. And that's really just an arbitrary choice on my part, which captures some of the more important and more interesting fossils that are going on. Unfortunately, we don't have casts of all of the material here, so I'll have to refer to some images as I talk about this, and this will be a little bit of a mix of original fossils and casts as I talk through. Now, let's all talk about the traditional way of looking at the sort of evolution of hominids. We thought until very recently that Homo erectus was dominant in Africa. Some people use the term Homo ergaster. I'll be doing some more specific talks on the difference between erectus and ergaster in later lectures. But the idea was a Homo erectus-like thing, and I'll just pull two examples. This is a Peking fossil. This is in Dutu in Tanzania. And but the classic Homo erectus, you get a morphology that looks a bit like this, where you have this sort of occipital torus or occipital bun that appears here. You have a low slung brain case, these large brow ridges that go on, but the cranial capacity generally doesn't get exceptionally large, maybe just over 1,000 cc's, with some of them that go down approaching much smaller things if they are Homo erectus of say 650 cubic centimeters. So it was a beautiful intermediate between that and later Homo sapiens. Now this is an original fossil. This is the border cave skull that I have here. This was reconstructed in plaster, so these yellow areas are the original. You can see the huge difference between what this and what I just showed you, a rounded cranium, very clearly the loss of those large supraorbital ridges, no sagittal keeling, which I'll show you better on the cobway skull in just a moment. So big difference between those, but we thought we went from that Homo erectus to something like this, and that was thought to occur at about the same time the genetic evidence is telling us that there are we're seeing the emergence of modern humans somewhere around 200,000 years in Africa, and it would later migrate out of Africa, say 60 to 80,000 years ago. And that was a really simple story. Then that story started to get a lot more difficult as we began to make new discoveries and we began to date older finds. One of the big shocks that came recently was the Jebel Hood redating that was done. Jebel Hood is a site in Morocco, so it's North Africa, and it was redated to two dates on some of the hominid specimens: 286,000 plus or minus 32,000 years, and 315,000 plus or minus 34,000 years, and that was a surprise, because here you had a hominid that was leaning towards Homo sapiens, although there are plenty of people who don't think that's a classical Homo sapiens, certainly not as derived as the border cave specimen that I've just shown you. and that indicated that we clearly had a very early Homo sapiens. In that same paper, they spent a lot of time talking about this specimen. This is the specimen from Florisbad. It's Florisbad face and part of the skull. And it certainly appears to be a kind of archaic-ish Homo sapiens, maybe even a little bit more derived than the Jebeler Hood fossils. It's got a bit of a brow ridge that you can see here. Very thick cranium, at least for a modern human. Very big brain size, a brain size possibly up in the 1,300 cubic centimeter size range, relatively broad face and broadening nose, but clearly something that is approaching the Homo sapiens model. The dates on Florisbad come from 1996 and date to 259,000 plus or minus 35,000 years. So right on the same dates as Jebeler Hood. And this was used in that paper to argue for this widespread morphology of sort of these early Homo sapiens-like forms with a stone tool culture called the Middle Stone Age, a kind of blade, a more advanced, certainly much more advanced stone tool culture than the Acheulean, which is what preceded that, with blades and other more sophisticated tools. John Hawkes and I recently put out a preprint on some of the problems with that, though. While I think the Jebeler Hood dates are pretty good, they've been done with the most modern, largely electron spin resonance dating. These dates are much more problematical. They were done in the early days of ESR, but that's not just the problem. And in fact, though, just to digress for a moment, they were correcting dates done by the same lab at the same time that had the Jebeler Hood fossils much younger. So there's already questions about the dates at that time. But there are many more problems with that. One is that this fossil comes from a peat bog, and the radiation sampling wasn't done in the peat. It was actually done in different sediments at Florisbad that have nothing to do with this discovery, and that may put important error into it. Another, though, is just the context itself. They weren't dating this face and skull. They were dating a tooth that was found back at the early parts of the 20th century that was not directly associated with this fossil. So we don't know if those are one and the same thing. Secondly, Florisbad's a very complex site. It has a lot of radiation in the water that fluctuates over time, and these methods of geochronological dating are very sensitive to that sort of thing. It's also a methane spring. This fossil was actually exposed back in the early 20th century by a methane explosion, and pressure and shock waves and heat can have effect on these. And so what John and I were saying in that article is we don't trust that date. In fact, we go so far as to say we don't think you'll ever actually be able to date this because of not only a lack of context, we don't know if the tooth is associated directly with this face and this skull, and furthermore, all the potential radiation contamination, and that would include also X-rays. It's been X-rayed many times. So we kind of said we need to set this aside for the time being. So part of the muddle might be that some of these things that are presumed to be in association might not have good dates on them, and this may be one of those. Why were we so interested in that? Well, of course, because of Homo Naledi. Homo Naledi is the same time and place, effectively. Naledi dates to 236,000 to 335,000 years, with the date hovering most likely around 250,000 years. So it's exactly the same time and space that these things are supposed to be at. And just to give you some perspective, Neo here, who unfortunately I can't bring the original out because he's trapped in the United States under COVID-19 lockdown, is supposed to exist within about 400 kilometers of this beast. Now, Neo is the largest brained of the Homo Naledi, just approaching 600 cubic centimeters. This is more likely more than twice that size. And let me show you some others. This is now an original This is DH3, Naledi hominid 3, and you can really get a sort of idea of the very different morphology and extraordinarily different cranial size variation that we're dealing between Homo naledi and these large-brained, more archaic forms of Homo sapiens. And just give you, as well as, of course, many different differences in morphology, the pinching behind the orbits of Homo naledi, which is very different among many, many other characters. So these, why would that be important? These are supposed to be sitting effectively in the same time and the same space. That has problems because, number one, we don't know who's making a lot of these stone tools. It could be as likely that Homo naledi is making the tools rather than a large brain form. But we're arguing that the evidence for a large brain form in southern Africa is very poor. Now, just after we came out with that paper, Kabwe came to play. Kabwe is from Zambia. It is a very important fossil because it's been long known to our science. It was found in 1921 and was just redated. It's a very weird thing, by the way. It's kind of a mix between Homo erectus, Homo sapiens. It was originally put in its own species, Homo rhodesiensis, and was then placed in Homo heidelbergensis by some, but it's a tricky thing to understand because it's got, again, a large brain, 1,300 cubic centimeters, got a lot of characters of Homo erectus, this sort of low-slung brain, sagittal keeling, these big supraorbital tori, and yet you can see how different that is from something like Homo naledi, and yet the new date on this, which just is hot off the press a few weeks ago, is 274 to 324,000. So these are all effectively in the same time, in the same space. Let me, just to really impress you, put this little female Homo naledi in front of Kabwe, and you can get an idea of that these things. What was that old Sesame Street thing? One of these things is not like the other. So that puts three things potentially in Africa at the same time and space. So what follows after that, very quickly, we have what are clearly Homo sapiens adulto from Hera, Buri in Ethiopia, also known as Herto man, at 160,000 years. And that looks to be very clearly a Homo sapiens. So all of this at the same time. And then just preceding that, you have things like Ndutu, which has been called a Homo erectus, but lacks some of the clear Homo erectus features that we described, although it does have a little bit of this occipital torus, and it does have the large brow ridges, but that's only at 400,000 years. So again, right in that same time range. We have other contenders here in southern Africa. We have some small fossil fragments from places like Cave of Hearts. This is the original. We don't have a whole lot of it, but very Homo sapiens-like teeth. Here's a radius that comes from there. It's thought that this specimen is associated with the last of the Acheulean and the first of the Middle Stone Age, which would put it right in this 300,000 to 400,000 year time range. But it certainly is not a Homo naledi and doesn't share really many characteristics with that at all. We really can't compare it to something like the fluorospad specimen. So, what's going on in this time period where we have all of these potential different things on? I think there's a couple of things we can talk to. One is that we have to be careful with some of the dates. I wouldn't trust the fluorospad date at this time. The problem is the tooth was destroyed in the process. We can't redate that, but again, as I said, it's not associated with it. I think it is becoming clear that there is at least Homo Naledi, which we know is in that time period, and we have the Jebel Hood fossils beyond that. Why am I being cautious with Rhodesiensis? I think the dating methods that were done are very sound. My problem is both with the context that this fossil was originally discovered in and the unknown radiation it's been exposed to. ESR relies on understanding the radioactive history that's been associated with the specimen, and that's a problem here. Why? Kabwe is a lead and zinc mine. In fact, if you look at the original documentation, this was found almost encased in a lead environment. We don't know, therefore, what sort of the exposure of radiation would have been over the hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of years that this was. And we don't know what that would do to the dates. We also don't have good records of how often this specimen was X-rayed, particularly with very high dose early X-rays. We don't have an idea of that dosage, so all of that has to be guessed. So I'm not saying don't believe this date. What I'm saying is I think I'd be very cautious about that date. So it may be that some of the dates are not so good and that we're associating things that shouldn't be associated, whether this is younger or older or the exact age that it's been said at around 300,000 years. I don't know right now. But for now, that's the best science we have on this. So let's work on the idea that there are these three forms, at least in Africa at that time. What does it mean? Well, it means for us that the world just got really, really complex. It means that what are these hominids associated with? They all look like capable tool makers. There's a tendency, and you see this a lot in the press and even in scientific papers, to instantly associate the large brains with the more sophisticated toolkits. But I think what we have to do in light of all of this evidence is we have to be cautious. We have to be very cautious about which hominid species we're associating with what tools. Because in fact, if fluorspad is not in context, and it's not in good context, we can't associate it with the Middle Stone Age tools that are found at that site. Homo naledi is likely associated with those same Middle Stone Age, those more complex tools, and it's really the only hominid we have in abundance and in good context and associated with those tools. So maybe I would hypothesize that it's the maker of the stone tools. I know that would be very surprising because of its very small brain, but I think that's something we have to look at. Whatever comes out of this period of redating and new discoveries, it shows that we need a lot more fossils, and we need them from a lot more geographical regions in Africa, and we need fossils in good archaeological context as well, and we need a lot more fossils of like kinds of specimens, because often these things are sitting in glorious isolation. They just sit there as the only examples. And then there's some really scary things, and I just sort of want to bring this fossil out just because it'll blow your mind, because it blew my mind when I first saw it. Look at the size of this specimen. This is a proximal femur from Berg Aukos, Namibia, that came, again, unfortunately, from down a mine, and so we don't have its original context, but it's a monster. It's almost twice the size of what you would see in a modern human, or at least it'd be something like a 7-foot-tall modern human. I don't think that it was. It's clearly heavily fossilized. A lot of people have wanted, of course, to put it onto something like this, but it would be big even for something like that. So we don't have a date on this. A lot of people, just by its size and its thickened shaft and other aspects of its anatomy, by the way, this is the real thing, have said that it must be from the Middle Pleistocene, when all these big guys like Kabwe are wandering around out there. The answer is we just don't know, but the reason I'm showing it to you is it gives you the potential that there are other things out there. So that's my answer. The answer is I don't know to that question. It's complex, clearly. We need more fossils. We need to make sure that the dates are good, and we need to be careful about using all the dates that are in front of us, all the chronology that's in front of us. Make sure that we really test the chronology when it's out there. For now, we have small brain hominids that are primitive. We have large-brained hominids like Jebel or Hood that are in North Africa. We have some others that might be in those same time periods, and there's likely stuff we haven't discovered. That's the final message. From the University of the Witwatersrand Fossil Hominid Vault. You can follow me on @Lee_Berger on Twitter, and like my Facebook page at Prof. Lee R. Berger. We'll talk again soon. Be safe out there.